Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
The St. Louis Browns moved to Baltimore for the 1954 season after having played in St. Louis since 1902. During their years in St. Louis, the Browns, they didn't meet with much success, but they did have a few good or great players over the years, including George Sisler, Rogers Hornsby for a few years, and even Hall of Famer Heine Manush for a couple of seasons. But there was another guy who spent almost his entire career with the Browns, and he is long forgotten and overlooked. A guy who broke Babe Ruth's streak of consecutive seasons winning the American League home run title. A guy who was as natural a hitter the game has ever seen. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to take a look back on his remarkable career. We're talking Ken Williams.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could be here. And today, a real forgotten superstar of the 1920s, Ken Williams. And joining us today will be Dave Heller, the author of the book, Ken Williams, A Slugger in Ruth's Shadow. It's a terrific biography recapping the career of Ken Williams, the plight of the St. Louis Browns, and a whole lot more. Williams is truly one of baseball's most overlooked superstars. It took him a while to break through, but once he did, it was apparent to everyone that the guy could hit. I mean, really hit. And once he listened to the advice of teammates and made a slight adjustment in his approach, he added mammoth power as well. In fact, Babe Ruth won 4 straight home run titles in 6 out of 7 years. The only year he didn't win was 1922, and that's when Williams interrupted his streak with 39 taters. For his career, Williams hit 196 home runs to go along with a career batting average of .319. And there's no telling how many more home runs he would have hit if ballparks had the shorter fences they do today, and if balls that left the park fair and later curved foul were counted as home runs instead of foul balls. Now, Williams, who originally came up with the Reds, was not a very good defensive ball player, at least in the beginning. And when the Reds cut him, he went back to the minors and worked hard to get better in the outfield. When he returned to the majors and the St. Louis Browns in 1919, he was a different player and became a fixture in their lineup for the better part of the next 9 years. And we will get into all of that with Dave in just a bit. We'll also talk about the devastating injuries that Ken sustained and his fictitious age that also contributed to his ultimate demise, although he could still hit. And we'll also talk about the irony of the designated hitter, a suggestion made by the National League. That's right, the National League, that was ultimately nixed by the American League and later, as we all know, adopted by the American League and nixed by the National League. Had there been a DH, Williams just might have been able to play for several more years. Now, before we get into all of that, first, a little housekeeping. You can find out more about Sports Forgotten Heroes by visiting our webpage, sportsfh.com. There we also have contact information so you can drop us a line and send in your suggestions or make comments about your favorite episodes. Follow us on Twitter at SportsFHeroes, Instagram, Sports Forgotten Heroes, or look for our page on Facebook. And, as always, please give us a rating wherever you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So, Ken Williams. He broke in with the Cincinnati Reds in 1915 and stuck with the Reds through the early part of the 1916 season before getting sent down to the minors in a numbers game. Williams worked hard on his game and signed with the St. Louis Browns in 1918, although he played in just 2 games because of the war, and he didn't play a full season until 1920. His first big season came in 1921 when he led the Browns with 24 home runs, 117 RBI, and he hit .347. His batting average wouldn't dip below .300 until 1926 when he hit .280. Ken was one of the most streakiest hitters, and when he got hot, look out, you just couldn't get him out. And joining us now to talk more about Ken Williams is the author of the book, Ken Williams, A Slugger in Ruth's Shadow, Dave Heller. David, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could join us.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk about Ken Williams, and it's a pleasure to be on here with you.
Oh, thanks so much. So before we get into the story of Ken Williams, I have to mention this. You are at least the third guest I've had on Sports Forgotten Heroes who has attended, in some sort of fashion, American University.
How about that?
Yeah, it's, and
Who knew we had those guys turn them on?
And my son graduated from American back in December. So
awesome.
I've got to ask, what is it about American University and writing about Sports Forgotten Heroes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. Your son and I are a few years apart, I'm guessing. So he's extending the timeline a bit. But I don't know. There were a lot of sports guys when I was there. Maybe there were a lot of sports guys when your son was there. I don't know. DC is a great town. It's a great school. So I don't know.
Just found it interesting. What a coincidence.
Yeah.
In fact, Neil Rosendahl, who joined us on episode 39 for a discussion on Duke Slater, he also attended American University, as did Tom Simon, who was just on recently talking about Ray Collins. So it's pretty cool.
Sounds like we need to get together in a little group chat between the 3 of us here and see what's going on.
Absolutely. So, Ken Williams, how did you discover him and why write a book about him?
Sure. Well, I'll try to make it as simple as I can. But basically, I grew up a fan of the Baltimore Orioles. I'm not from that area at all, but I became a fan for, I can't tell you why. I just did. Probably they were good back in the day when I was growing up. And then as I got older, I really became interested in the history of baseball. Mm-hmm. And so the St. Louis Browns became the Baltimore Orioles. So I kind of became like a de facto Browns fan, if you could be a fan, for a team that no longer exists. And then, discovered Ken Williams. And basically the only thing I knew about him was he was the first guy to hit 30 home runs and 30 steals in a season. Mm-hmm. And that was always a great trivia question, like in middle school, high school cafeteria, when the guys are throwing out sports trivia. But that's all I knew about him, was basically, that's it, 30-30 guy. So, that's where it stood for years and years and years. And then, a few years back, I was thinking to myself, well, why can't I, who was this guy besides the 30-30 player? And then I later found out, led the league in home runs during the Ruth era. Maybe I can find out more about him. It was a passion project, I guess, to use a cliche. So I just kind of did the research, and I got a lot lucky here and there and found out as much as I could. And there you go, wrote it up.
Yeah, quite the book. And, one of the things that intrigued me about Ken is this. You open your book about a banquet in which past baseball stars from St. Louis, that's the Browns and the Cardinals, were honored. And Ken was invited to that banquet, and he was, I guess, fearful that he had been forgotten and that no one remembered him. But that was pretty far from the truth, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah, you got to remember now. This is back in the 50s, so no internet. He lived in Oregon, well away from Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball wasn't even in California until the late 50s, and at that time, who wouldn't remember Ken? He hadn't played in 35 years, so it definitely was big. And he didn't really travel outside Oregon too often. It wasn't like he was making appearances or doing TV interviews or newspaper interviews. So he was really afraid that he'd go back there, not maybe be embarrassed, but he was once a big wig, and all of a sudden, the Cardinals are now the Browns are gone, and the Cardinals were the big thing, Stan Musial and those guys. But as you mentioned, he gets to the banquet, and it turns out people did remember him, and kind of I think they appreciated it. When you don't hear from someone for so long, and there he is in front of you again, you remember the history and the things he did, and so this is your chance to appreciate that person, and then that's what happened to him. The thing about you go to a game and they introduce old timers, and they get big hands. It was a very, very similar thing.
Well, you mentioned Oregon. He came from the booming metropolis of Grants Pass. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, what was living in Grants Pass like, and how did baseball figure into all of this?
Yeah, Grants Pass. I guess Cowtown would be a good term. It took a while to have paved roads, so the streets were often full of mud and things that cows and horses leave behind. So you walked in the sidewalks a little more, on the wooden boards to stay off the streets because you didn't want your shoes to get too dirty. So it was definitely that kind of town. They didn't get telephones until the early 20th century. They stopped selling alcohol in the early 20th century before Prohibition even. So there wasn't much else to do in those kind of small towns, and baseball was, that was a national pastime. And baseball was sprouting up everywhere, and little club teams here and there, all throughout the country. Even though, like I said, there was no Major League Baseball west of St. Louis, still baseball is very popular. And so in Oregon, all these little towns created teams. And, Ken somehow found out he had the proficiency. He was very tall for the time and very athletic, and found out that he could play and quickly became one of the better players in Oregon.
Tell us a little bit about his upbringing, his family, and the fact that he dropped out of school after the 8th grade. Why did he drop out? What was it like for his family in Grants Pass?
Yeah, so his dad was kind of I don't know. He did a lot of stuff. He bounced around. I kind of think of him like a Jackie Gleason. You're looking for that big honeymooners. You're looking for that big score. And I kind of not that he was a big guy like that, but he bounced around like he tried to do gold mining once, and he was a teacher, and he ran a hotel. He was always moving, doing different jobs, trying different things. And education back then, it wasn't as important as it would become in later, in American history. If you weren't really inclined to go to school, go to work and help the family out instead. So that's kind of how it became. I don't think he was necessarily enthralled in being a student rugby playing ball and then going to class. So 8th grade is as far as he got, and he found work instead around town, helped the family out, and then played ball and realized he could make money doing that.
Now, where did his ability on the diamond come from, and how was he discovered? I mean, like you said, it's not like Grants Pass was on the map, especially as a hotbed for baseball talent.
Right, no. Well, as it turns out, there was a player on a team that Ken would eventually play for in Grants Pass named Bud Pernall, who got discovered and went to Pacific Coast League and eventually the Tigers, pitched for the Tigers in the major leagues. And so that kind of gave a glimpse to, hey, there is something beyond this little town here. Baseball could take you elsewhere. And so Ken would play for Grants Pass, the Grants Pass teams, but then he got on a team in California, quote unquote amateur team or semi-pro team, and basically it was you'd work. They'd funnel money for under the table, and you'd play for the team while supposedly working and using air quotes and working for like a local factory or something like that. Basically he'd maybe be a night detective and just sit outside and do nothing. While he's getting paid to play baseball during the week. So he did that and made a name for himself. But to get this, getting discovered, sometimes it takes a lot of luck. Something fortuitous happens, and in this case, there was a league in Western Canada. It was basically the lowest minor league of them all. Like if you think of how low you can go, it was the bottom rung. Think of Western Canada, small towns in Canada, and they hired a guy named Billy Hewlin to be a manager of the team in Regina, Saskatchewan. Or Alberta. I'm sorry. My Canadian provinces are horrible. I apologize to your Canadian listeners. But anyways, this team in Regina, they had been around. They went to Funk. They came back. They hired this guy, Billy Hewlin. And Billy Hewlin had some pro experience, major league experience, and he, as it turns out, was living in Oregon. So where did he go look for players? Where he knew, where he lived. So he started looking for players in Oregon. And many of the players he signed were in fact from Oregon. So somewhere along the line, either he was tipped off or saw Ken play, and that's how Ken became a professional.
The interesting thing about his time in the Canadian League, he was known as Bill Williams instead of Ken. Why?
Right. Yeah. Well, he was known as Dinky Williams in Grants Pass because one of those opposite nicknames. He was not dinky at all. He was a bigger guy. Why would he call Bill? I think it's just because his last name was Williams, right? They took Will Williams and made it Bill. Bill Williams. It was easier to print out than anything else. They didn't really take time to learn these guys' first names, or they did what they want to do to save space. So Kenneth is kind of a longer first name, so why not think of Bill? Guys in papers back then did what they wanted to do. They shortened last names and longer, guys with long names and things like that. So. Yeah, he had a lot of different names going through his professional career: Dinky, Bill, Kenneth, Ken, Kenny. But he had them all.
Interesting. Now he also had quite the temperament, didn't he? And he was not afraid to take on the establishment. He was regarded as a moaner. He earned the nickname Crab because of his attitude, and he never shied away from a fight. Tell us a little bit about his temperament and how it came to be. And I guess, did this carry over to his time in the majors?
To answer the last part first, yes. He definitely was. I consider, I've often thought about this, how to compare him. And if you remember back in the 80s, Greg Jeffries was always known kind of as an intense guy, and people would kind of not like him maybe because he'd argue calls a lot and be upset. I feel that's the way Ken was. He did not like when a call did not go his way, and he would make it known to the umpire. And back then there was only one or two in a game, and he'd make it known pretty quickly that he did not agree with the call. And he got the reputation of being, as you mentioned, a crab. He did get into some fights, and baseball was different back then. There were, especially in the 1900s, 1910s, there was what they call rowdyism. There was a lot of fights, and especially in the minor leagues. And again, one umpire, maybe a game or two, it's hard to break up a fight when these guys are going at it. So it was kind of it was his persona, but also kind of the attitude of the game at the time. It kind of allowed for that, even though not everyone liked it. Maybe he went over the top a little bit, but he was certainly not alone as the only guy who was complaining about stuff.
The one thing he could do was hit. And, he could really hit. But the one thing he had a little bit of difficulty with was defense. He was, at least early on, he wasn't the greatest of defensive ball players. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say in his career, he really was a good outfielder, and then he became a major leaguer. His big problem was ground balls. He was not a good fielder of ground balls, and from the research I found, he played infield a lot in the minor leagues, third base. He came up as a shortstop, like in semi-pro ball. He put out third base in the low minors when he first started in the Western Canada League, and he was not proficient at that. Like I said, the ground balls good. Even the outfield, those low liners are balanced. He just wouldn't field them very well. I don't know why that was. He just was not a good good at getting ground balls. He had a very strong arm. And that would also account for errors because these guys back then too, cutoffs were not a common thing. The Browns eventually would do it in the mid-20s, early 20s, but cutoffs were not a thing back then. They were just trying to throw guys out, and players took risks in the base pass. They took risks throwing, so he made a lot of errors, throwing the ball as well. But he was very fast and had great range, and really had a great arm. But the actual getting to the ball sometimes was a problem, and especially playing the infield. And he never really played the infield in the majors. That was mainly in the minor leagues where he had a lot of problems with the infield. But in the major leagues, again, most of his errors were either on throws or just these ground balls that for whatever reason he had difficulty picking up.
Ken played in competitive amateur baseball and ultimately minor league ball. And as you had mentioned before, he played in Canada. It was a great place for him because he really learned how to lose. And this would serve him well throughout his career, obviously playing with the St. Louis Browns, one of baseball's all-time losers. But before he went to the Browns, Major League Baseball scouts were taking notice of him in the minors, particularly the Cincinnati Reds. How did he end up with the Reds?
So it was very interesting. So he was in Canada, as you mentioned, Western Canada League, and actually his second year there, he got cut by the team he was on. They had a new manager, and they got rid of him. Research they say why they did it. I have a few reasons in the book, but it was very perplexing, at least. He went to Edmonton in the same league, and this is 1914. So with World War I coming on, Canada was involved in that, so that league shut down, and Edmonton sold him to Spokane, which is a higher league up, and he really started to flourish in Spokane. And that was actually a very good team in Spokane he was playing for, and so they got a lot of notice. They're in first place. He was putting up great stats. He was stealing bases. He was hitting home runs. He had a high batting average, and that league, the Northwest League, got a lot of major league scouts. And it turns out someone from Spokane actually made a letter to the owner of the Cincinnati Reds and said, "Hey, we got a guy here in Spokane who maybe you should take a look at. Ken Williams. He's doing all the things I just said. Hitting the ball and great player." So this is how scouting sometimes existed back in 1915. You send a letter to the team owner and they take a look at you. So Cincinnati was in need of a left-handed hitting outfielder. They were kind of an independent race, sort of. It was a very tight race, and they actually wanted a guy named Jack Smith, who was once Ken's teammate in the Canadian League, and was playing for a different team in the Northwest League. And they wanted Jack Smith now. They wanted because they were in this pennant race. They needed a player, but the team that had Jack Smith said, "No, we're not going to sell him until the season's over." So there were a few teams after Ken, the Giants, if I remember correctly, the Tigers, and then the Reds came in, and basically the Reds offered more money. And that's how it gets done. They offer more money as it gets done. And the funny part is, Edmonton, was sold him to Spokane, made a deal that if Spokane sold Ken to a major league team, they'd get some of the money. So Edmonton got half the money, $500 of the first $1,000 that was paid off, went to Edmonton, even though Edmonton was no longer even existing because the league was defunct in 1915 because of the war. So that was kind of interesting. So the Reds paid $1,000 up front for Ken, and then if I remember correctly, I believe they had another $500, $1,000 they paid after the season, and then if you were on the roster after a certain date in 1916, they paid another $1,000 or $500, whatever it was. So, but he fit the criteria they needed. They had a kind of older outfielder they wanted that wasn't doing well, and they want a left-handed hitter. He checked those boxes, and like I said, they were kind of in a pennant race. They were like maybe in fifth place, 5 games out. It was tight. They were just trying
sort
to
of like
moves.
Today.
So today, exactly. So they're trying to kind of make some moves to get up in the race. It didn't work out eventually, as it turns out. But he was not the only. They made a couple moves to try to move up in the rankings, and for various reasons, it didn't work out for either the Reds or for Ken.
But he showed he could. When he got to Cincinnati, he certainly showed he could hit. But I guess it was his fielding that again was an issue. And as you said, every time this guy did something good in the field, he followed that up with a bad play. And every time he did something positive at the plate, he followed that up with things like being too aggressive on the base paths. So talk a little bit about the abbreviated time he did play with the Reds.
Yeah. So if you go like on Baseball Reference and look at the stats, you'll see he hit 242, which people say, oh, 242, that's horrible. But really, the league average is around 250, so it wasn't like he was that bad. He was actually one of the better hitters in the Reds during his time there. One of the problems in Cincinnati was the manager was Buck Herzog, and he was a protege of John McGraw, famous Giants manager.
Mm-hmm.
And he tried to be just like John McGraw, which was the problem because he was trying to be John McGraw with no experience, whereas John McGraw had been doing it for a while.
Right, and there's only one John McGraw.
Right, only one John McGraw. The players didn't really like Buck Herzog too much, and Herzog liked his style of hitting. And Herzog was one of those, old style took him off on the bat, slap hitters. And that was not Ken. So Herzog wanted Ken to be like Herzog. He wanted him to be more of a slap hitter and not use a heavy bat. And Ken liked using a real heavy bat, and he forced Ken to use a lighter bat. So that was one reason why Ken's batting average really wasn't what it was. He showed very little power in Cincinnati, and he had power throughout the minor leagues. He was a power hitter his entire career, not just with St. Louis later on. He was always a home run hitter. So his batting took a little bit of a downturn still. And when it went to 1916, he was thought to be one of the guys who was going to be starting in the outfield. He got that chance, but he made some really bad errors in Pittsburgh one day. He was playing what they call the sun field. The sun around his eyes. He botched a couple of fly balls. Herzog pulled him from the game, put in Greasy Neal, who was later an NFL Hall of Famer, put him in the outfield, and he made a good catch and had a hit later in the game. And by May 10th that year, they had to cut the roster down. And guess what? The Reds owed more money if Ken was on the roster on May 10th. So guess who got sent back to the minor league?
Right, Ken Williams.
Yeah, Ken Williams. So it was a combination of things. Yes, his fielding was not up to par, probably, as I mentioned. And Herzog forced him to really hurt his hitting style. I think did not help his cause either. So back to the minors he went to 1916.
Right, and he ultimately wound up in Portland with the Beavers in the PCL. And this is where his game really took off, even defensively. First, how did he turn his defense around?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think he knew what happened in Cincinnati. Was not good, and he wanted to get back to the major leagues. And then I think he realized he needed to be an all-around player, not just hitting the ball. And he really, I think he worked at his game, and they left him in the outfield too. He was no longer an infielder, which he even pitched some in the lower minors, and that stuff stopped. He was now an outfielder. I think it helps when you know who you are. It solidifies a little bit and gives him more confidence. So I think that helped a little bit. And I think he was hitting the ball. He got back to where he was, back to the heavy bat, back to pounding the ball and driving the ball in the park. He had 3 home runs in a game in Portland, and got noticed for that. And the leading the league in home runs and steals and hitting 340. So I think that all that stuff, that confidence really it spills over to every part of your game when you can get back to where he was. And I think that really helped.
And so he plays a couple of years down there, and 2 teams really took notice, the Pirates and the St. Louis Browns. And the Browns got him. How did this go down?
The Browns got him late in 1917. He was having a great season in 1917, and it was kind of the same thing the last time. Sometimes teams wanted players right then and there. The Browns didn't care. Like he can finish the season out. So that helped. But one of the things was back then there wasn't like minor league affiliations like they have nowadays. Like here I'm in Wisconsin, the Brewers have AAA in San Antonio, AA in Biloxi, et cetera, et cetera. Back then it was a free-for-all. No one was affiliated with anybody, but certain teams kind of hooked up with other teams. So Portland had a deal with Cleveland. They would just supply players to Cleveland for a couple of years. And then out of nowhere, Portland decided, we're going to give a player to Milwaukee, the American Association, instead of Cleveland. And that took Cleveland off. So that broke off relations between those teams. So then it became anyone could get Portland's players at that point. And then at some point, Portland needed a first baseman, and the Browns no longer needed one because they had George Sisler. So Portland bought Babe Borton, a first baseman from the Browns, and owed money for him. And guess what? Hadn't paid it off yet. So in return, the Browns came asking for Ken Williams. They said, hey, what about it that $1,500 we owe you? You take Ken instead. And that's how that worked out. Now, the manager of the team was not thrilled, and the manager was the nephew of the owner. He was like, I could get more money for Ken than we got. It's ridiculous. He didn't understand that Portland was a little in need of money. They were losing money, and they had to make this deal to kind of save their money in the long run. So Ken was kind of a victim or a help of a previous transaction. He was the Parson Postal, I guess. He was the guy that had to fill the bill. So St. Louis was fortunate. They traded Babe Borden for Ken Williams any day of the week.
So St. Louis was fortunate, but I don't know how fortunate Ken Williams was, because he could have maybe gone to the Pirates. So he ends up with the Browns. And this was around the same time that the Federal League was around. And many players from all the leagues, from the Federal League, from the National League, from the American League, they were all fighting for bigger contracts. Now, Williams, who hadn't played in the majors since 1916 with the Reds, he actually had the chutzpah to hold out for more money, or he would stay back with Portland. How big a risk was that? Did he even care?
Ken had chutzpah, that's for sure. Back in 1911, I found this out that he was signed on. He was playing in semi-pro. He was going to play in the minors, and he got signed on to Portland. Portland, they needed a player, and supposedly it was Boston Red Sox, and they needed to play a week just to fill out the roster spot. And said, "Okay, thanks. We'll stay. We'll get back to you later. You'll come into spring training with our Sacramento team." Started playing. Sacramento was playing in Portland. Mm-hmm. And Sacramento said, "Oh, we'll bring you to spring training next year. Just lay low." And it turned out that they only paid him for like a week, and Ken thought he should be paid for the whole season. So he basically he didn't sue, but it was what's called the National Commission, and said, which was the commissioner of the day, it was the three guys made up a board, and said, "Hey, I need to get paid for the whole season." And they said, "No, he could have been blackballed." I don't know why he did that for like basically a month's pay, I guess. It was pretty good money for him. But he usually could have been blackballed, and didn't happen. So he has precedence of kind of not worrying about future consequences, I guess we should say.
It was a little odd that way. Of course, you've mentioned it a couple of times. This was right around the time as well with the World War going on. And several major leaguers were called into service. And even though Williams made the Browns in 1918, it really wouldn't be until 1920 that he'd make an impact on the team. But right. Before we get there, let's talk about his age. He hit his real age and was actually older than what was listed on the roster. And I'm not talking by like a year or two. I mean, he was older than what he was listed at on the roster. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I couldn't really find out when or why he figured this out, but this is not something that was just Ken Williams, and this is something that's gone on into the 21st century. Mm-hmm. Players lie about their age, and he was, when he got called to Cincinnati, he claimed to be 21, and he was actually 25. It's a big difference, but once you claim to be a certain age, guess what? That's what sticks with you, and that's so people always thought he was much younger than he really was. So when he was with the Browns, he was 28, and he really didn't. In 1918, so his first year, his first full season, he was 30 years old in 1920. That was the first season he actually played an entire season. And I guess you can't blame the guy. As a major league owner or general manager or business manager back then, they called him. Would you want a guy who's 28, or would you want the guy who's 24?
Right, right.
It's not. It's pretty easy to figure out who you go for. And it turns out, it never hampered him. He played well in his late 30s, which most players did not do. It's pretty impressive how late he did play. But, maybe it helped his career. Maybe it saved his career. I don't know. But that that age thing really helped him out. And he never got caught. Or at least they did, and no one ever spilled the beans about it. In the Sporting News obituary, they had his age wrong. So this is, 50 years later, they still didn't know his correct age.
But
he could easily got caught because he had to fill out his war. He had to fill out his, he got drafted. He had to fill it out, but no one ever figured it out. So
yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. So when he had he did serve time in the Army. But he never made it overseas. He was playing baseball, but the Army knew his real age, but nothing was never revealed.
Correct. So I think, if I remember correctly, the draft incorporated the age group that he was in, regardless whether it was his real age or his fake age. So there was no red flag. Like, well, why is he getting drafted? He's 28 years old, but it didn't matter because the draft incorporated such a large age range that he came right in. But yeah, the Army's not going to come out and they're not going to post his age. They just took him and they let him play baseball for 4 months. But then so he got shipped out, and basically I was told he got shipped out. He was heading over to Europe, and he was halfway there or wherever he was, and they said, "Oh, war's over." And they turned around and he came home.
And then he went to St. Louis and played for the Browns, and what a career. So when he first gets to St. Louis, he battled some injuries his first few years there, and then finally, in 1921, Ken Williams arrived. Talk about that 1921 season and how he finally turned the corner.
Yeah, so you mentioned 1919, to go back, he got hit by a pitch by Walter Johnson, who everyone I'm sure has heard of, ending his season prematurely. Hit 300, had a good slugging percentage. He's always a good slugger. Next year, 1920, also hit over 300, had a really good slugging percentage. Hit 10 home runs, which for the day was a lot. 1921, I guess Ken had a lot of power. In the minors or in the semi-pro ball, he was known as Home Run Williams. I mean, people think maybe that home runs never existed until Babe Ruth came around. Not true. Guys hit home runs, they just didn't try to hit a home run, so it was a little different. But Ken had a lot of power in the minor leagues, and he always had a lot of home runs, relatively speaking, to the era. And he hit to all fields. He was an all field hitter, left, center, right, didn't matter. And at the time, Sportsman's Park, where they played in St. Louis, had a shorter right field porch, 315, I'm going to say, down the line. And his teammates were, Babe Ruth was coming into his own as well in 1920, 1921. And he was off to a really hot, Babe Ruth was off to a really hot start in 21, hitting a lot of home runs early in the season. And he, of course, would naturally be a topic of conversation in dugouts and clubhouses. And one day during, the players were kind of sitting around, chewing the fat, talking baseball as they always did. And his teammates said to him, "Ken, if you change your stance and start hitting the right field instead of all field, you have the power to hit home runs like Ruth." And Ken never really thought of himself that way. He thought himself a good hitter, never thought of himself a great hitter. And he said, "Well, if my teammates feel this way, maybe I can do it." And he changed his stance. And lo and behold, he had 24 home runs in 1921. And as he would later say, normally people would think 24 home runs was a lot. Of course, Ruth hit like 59 that year. So it kind of got pushed to the back burner, but he was still second in the league in home runs, that season. And, the next year really took up. But 21 is when it really started. He hit 347 that year as well. So it wasn't like he was just a home run hitter. He could hit. He could hit to all fields. They said he was fast. But he changed his style of hitting in 1921 to accommodate where he was playing.
And this is at a time, and this would affect almost every ball player, particularly a guy like Williams or Babe Ruth. I mean, who knows how many more home runs each of them would have had the rule been different. So back then, if you hit the ball over the fence and it then curved, into foul territory and it was still in view, it was a foul ball. So who knows how many others? Yeah,
he definitely lost a few. I mean, going through the papers and stuff, you read about it. Oh, there's a home run and curve foul. Like, oh my gosh, there's another home run he lost. He could have over 40 and 22 for sure, but he definitely lost he definitely lost a few over the years because of that rule.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the other things I noticed in reading your book, which everyone is a terrific book, Ken Williams, A Slugger in Ruth's Shadow. What a terrific book. I encourage everyone out there to get a copy of this. It's really, really good, very in-depth, and you will certainly learn a lot about baseball back then, how the game was played, some of the other rules, and of course, you're going to go way in depth on the type of ball player that Ken Williams was. And one of the things that struck me was he was a real streaky hitter. I mean, it was incredible. He'd have a 10-game hitting streak, then he wouldn't hit, then he'd have a 15-game hitting streak, then he'd be on base, 30 games in a row. I mean, how streaky was this guy? And you talked about this earlier. He used a really heavy bat.
Yeah, he was definitely, it's funny. I was kind of going back looking through my book just to make sure I was up to date and everything. It's been a few years since I wrote it, so I want to make sure I had it fresh in my head. And the other things I remember writing was about Ken would, he'd slump for 2 weeks or whatever, and then all of a sudden he'd pick it up, hit like 400 over 2 weeks. It's pretty incredible how he used this. He was a very streaky hitter.
David, you talk about this. It wasn't like he'd go on a 10-game or a 15 or a 20-game hitting streak, 1 for 4, 2 for 5. I mean, we're talking 3 for 4, 4 for 4, right. 2 for 4, 3 for 4, 1 for 4, 2 for 4, 3 for 5. I mean, it was just incredible the amount of hits he would string together. How did this, what was this about? How did he do this?
There's an old saying, there are certain players, they say, can fall out of bed and hit, or whatever that saying goes. That was him. He could fall out of bed and get up and grab a bat. And he'd go to spring training every year and just start knocking the ball. He'd just get there and start hitting. And I think that's what he was a hitter, and every hitter is going to go through slumps. That's the way it is. But he was such a good hitter that he'd go through great streaks. And that's why he's got a 319 career batting average. Because he could hit. And like I said before, he could hit to all fields when he wanted to. He'd change his style to go to more to right field later on. But he could hit everywhere, and he had power. And those fields were big too back then. Yes, there were some short porches in different places, but you go like some of these places in deep center field, you go 4 or 5, 500 feet. You can knock him over someone's head and start running like crazy. He could do that. He could hit it. He could hit in front. He could hit it over. He could hit in the gap. He's just a great hitter. And you say he did use the theory back then was heavier bat added more power. Nowadays they put a light bat for the quick swing. But even Ruth used the heavy bat, and Ken did too. At one point they 44 ounces, but the general range 40 to 44 ounces maybe. Or the general range, which sounds crazy nowadays, and guys using 32-ounce bats. But that was his theory: heavy bat, heavy hits.
But he had to be really strong to swing that heavy bat too. I mean, he was not a small guy, especially for back then.
Right, he was 6 feet tall, which doesn't sound big, but the average height back then was 5'8". And he was reportedly 6'1", 6'2", sometimes. So I think he once was at 6'3". I think it's because he looked tall. He was kind of lithe. He wasn't big and burly like a Ruth. He was more of a, just put together. And that's the way he was his whole life. He's had great metabolism, where he just was always in shape and always, never overweight. I wish I had his metabolism, but he was, always in great shape. That's just the way it was. He'd work, in the off season, doing whatever to stay in shape, and it paid off for him. And like you said, he obviously was very muscular and probably had really strong wrists.
So then along comes 1922, and what an incredible season. He hit a league-leading 39 home runs. He knocked in 155. He hit 332, and he stole 37 bases. In fact, he was a big-time threat on the bases. For his career, he stole 154. So, 1922. He's the first 30-30 player. He's the first player to have more home runs, he hit 37, than he did strikeouts with 31. He hit home runs in 6 straight games, was the first AL player to homer 2 times in the same inning. and he was the first AL player to hit 3 home runs in one game. I mean, what a year. Tell us about the 1922 season and the comparisons he drew to Babe Ruth, even though he said he was nothing like the Babe.
Right. Sometimes things click, and 2022, everything clicked for Ken. That St. Louis team is a really good hitting team. George Sisler's on that team. That had over 420 in front of him, which is one reason why he drove in so many runs. But the home runs also helped the cause. They were very aggressive. Lee Fold took over as manager in 1921. I want to say off the top of my head, and he was an aggressive, on the base pass kind of manager. He encouraged those guys to run. And you look at Ken Steele; they really pick up in that year. He never stole more than 20 bases other than that one year. Well, I'm going to put an asterisk there because really he had more than 37 steals that year, but official stats were spotty at best. And he actually probably had more than 155 RBI. We discovered more RBI that were not accounted for because they didn't really know how to. RBI was kind of a new stat, and they were still figuring it out. And a lot of times, they just didn't know who got credit for whatever. And steals, sometimes he'd be on the back end of a double steal, and they wouldn't give him credit for the back end of double steal. So he may have had 40 stolen bases that year, to be perfectly honest with you.
Wow.
But that year, was, he didn't start hot off the bat, but it slowly picked up. And Ruth was out for a suspension. So he got hot, and then all eyes were on him because he was putting up these Ruthian numbers, home run numbers, and Ruth wasn't playing. So all eyes turned to the guy who was hitting the home run, and that was Ken. And the pressure built up because he suddenly became a public figure. And Ruth was calling him out, publicly as well. When Ruth speaks, people listened and people wrote about it. And he never wilted. And he just kept hitting home runs. And, like I said, you named all the stuff he did. He was the first guy to hit 6 home runs 6 games in a row. He had a 3 home run game. And Ruth always wanted to be the first guy with 3 home runs in one game, and he didn't do it. It was Ken Williams. And you mentioned the 2 in 1 inning. 155 RBI, 153 games, so he had more ribbies in games played, which very few players have done. He did it twice in his career. He didn't. He was compared to Ruth often that year because of these are the 2 guys who were hitting home runs, and some papers try to compare them all to the same kind of player, but they really weren't. I mean, Ruth struck out. Ruth really went for home runs, and he would strike out a lot. As you mentioned, Ken did not strike out a lot. 31 times.
He didn't strike out a lot for his career.
For his career, you're right. And he was the only player. He's the only 30-30 player ever to have more home runs and steals than strikeouts in a season, ever. And that's now the 30-30 deal is a big deal to us now, but no one knew about it back then. No one cared.
It was almost like 50 years before another player hit 30 homers and stole 30 bases in the same year.
Right. There was only one 20-20 player previously, and that happened in 1911. So he was the second 20-20 player, and that was the Masters. He was the first guy to do it in the American League as well. He was the first 30-30 player, and Willie Mays did it in 55, around that territory, maybe 58, somewhere in there. So it was over 30 years later that anyone ever did 30-30 again. I said no one's ever done 30-30 and had 31 strikeouts. That's crazy.
Yeah.
But he has 332. He was clutch. You don't get 155 RBI. I know RBI is a statistic that a lot of stat heads, try to dismiss and whatever. You still got to knock him in. You got opportunities were there. You still got to produce, and he produced, and that was the best Browns team in history, probably of the Browns did go to the World Series in 1944. This Browns team was such a good team, and probably talent-wise was the best. Just they came up short, and they didn't have the pitching. And Slugger got hurt late in the year, but Ken was a big reason, and he got absolutely no MVP votes. Is probably the most ironic part of it all, just the way the situation was back then.
Yeah, you had written about that. That's crazy to think that he didn't get any MVP votes, and I guess it was George Sisler that was taking the votes.
Right, so back then you could only vote for one player per team. So Sisler would get the votes, and Ken did not. So he got no votes because Sisler, who was named MVP, or whatever they call it back then, Chalmers Award. Sisler got won the award. And Sisler got the award late in the year. During the season, they gave it to him. They didn't wait the season to end. It was just kind of funny as well. But it really, I mean, look at his numbers. It was an MVP. I always call it an MVP type season. It certainly was. I mean, it was 627 slugging percentage, over a 1 OPS, led the league in total bases and RBI and, things that home runs, obviously. He broke Ruth's streak, 30-30. Well, I don't know what else you could ask for. The guy had just an incredible season.
Sure did.
And played almost every day, too. He didn't hurt that year, so he stayed healthy, which was always a help.
So the Browns that year did challenge the Yankees. They were 93-61. Like you said, they went to the series in 44, but this was probably the best Browns team ever. And I think you might have even written at some point that in the history of baseball, they are like a top 20 to 25 team. That's how good they were. And this was probably the best team that Ken Williams ever played on. This guy never had any luck throughout his entire career, no matter what team he played on. And I guess that happens periodically to certain ball players. Did Ken ever talk about that in your conversations with his children and doing research? Did you ever find anything where Ken Williams was disappointed or said something about the poor teams he played on?
The Browns were up and down. He was there. I never really found anything that said that. Ken always just seemed to be in the moment. He didn't look back ever. He didn't talk about the past. I don't think he worried about the past. So just kind of whatever happened, and he's moved on to the next year and never really worried about it. He did play for a winner in Spokane 1915, but ironically, he was sold to Portland before the team clinched the pennant, so he never got a chance to celebrate the pennant. His one pennant he won, he never got a chance to celebrate. Unfortunately for him, but I don't think he's that kind of guy. I mean, obviously he wanted to win. What competitor doesn't want to win? But I don't think it festered on him or anything like that. It just wasn't the kind of guy he was.
Now, at that same time in 1922, the Browns took the Yankees all the way to the last weekend, and maybe there was a little shenanigans going on. No one will be able to prove it, but this was all during the time when the Red Sox would trade the Yankees, their better players. There was something with the Tigers at that point. Talk about that, maybe there was a little backdoor something or other going on to help the Yankees win the pennant and keep the Browns out.
Right. So the Red Sox and the Yankees, as those know, the curse of Babe Ruth and all that. Maybe people forget that since the Red Sox have been so good lately. But back then there was accusations that the Red Sox would help the Yankees out. Ruth being one deal, but there were plenty of others. Carl Mays, was another guy they traded to the Yankees, help out the Yankees. And in 1922, the Red Sox claimed they weren't going to trade their third baseman Joe Dugan, and it turned out they did, and they traded him to the Yankees, along with a couple other players. And this is like late July, and people were very upset. And not just, St. Louis Browns were upset, people in St. Louis were upset, but not just them. It was all across baseball. There was a talk of almost like collusion. Like the Red Sox were helping collude with the Yankees with these deals. And the deals and the players the Red Sox got back were marginal at best. And they tried to sell off as, we got these young players who were going to be great, and they really were, also ran, so they never did anything. So that was the first problem. The second problem was late in the year. You mentioned, the Browns did themselves. They had a 3-game series late in the year in St. Louis, and the Yankees, took the series, and that put them ahead in the pennant race. If the Browns win that series, the Browns are in the driver's seat. But nevertheless, there was still time left in the season. The Browns had a chance. They kind of, were probably dispirited to that series, but they were still a game back with 2 games left. And the Red Sox, in the 2 games, the penultimate game of the season, benched their ace starter and put in a rookie who got bombed in the first inning. They took him out and put the ace back in to relieve in the second inning. So it was, a little bit of hijinks there, perhaps. I don't want to say that the Red Sox gave the Yankees a pennant because the Browns had their chance. They win more games face to face. They win the pennant. But I'm sure that left a sour taste in their mouth that they didn't quite go where they should.
So they finished second in 1922, and they have high hopes for 1923. And Ken backed up that season pretty well. And the Browns, they were hoping to challenge the Yankees again. And as good as Williams was, however, he really wasn't the Browns' best player. That label fell on the shoulders of George Sisler, and he missed the whole year. He had like a bout with sinusitis or something like that. And St. Louis fell to 74 and 78. But Ken still hit a career best 357 that season, and he had 29 home runs and 91 ribbies. In 1924, again, St. Louis went 74 and 78. And Ken, he was solid again, 324 with 18 homers and 84 ribbies. But I think this might have been when age might have finally started to creep into his game. He dealt with a bunch of different ailments. Of course, the foul ball that broke his foot had nothing to do with his age, but still, he did have some injuries I think you could associate with age. 1925, he was really strong again. And he was hitting .331 with 35 home runs and 105 RBIs. St. Louis was playing pretty well, and then on August the 14th, he took one to the head from a pitcher in Cleveland. I think his name was like Babe Ruth or something like that.
Right. Yep.
And it knocked him unconscious. How scary was that? And how important a role did Cleveland's Chick Fuster play in possibly saving Ken's life?
Yeah, I mean, it was scary. I mean, remember, these guys didn't wear helmets, right? And it was a 3-0 pitch. It kind of came high and tight, and Ken flinched, and he flinched kind of into the ball. So clunked him right in the noggin, and he was out. I mean, he fell to the ground, was unconscious a little bit. So that's always scary, obviously.
Yeah.
You get hit, and and they said no protection. You're being protected by a cap, so that's no protection at all. So it took them. They revived him. They got him in the clubhouse, and they're going to get him in the shower to kind of wake him up and get his senses back. And Chick Fuster played for Cleveland, and years earlier he had got his skull fractured by hit by pitch in spring training. And he was always, whenever someone got hit, he was always very concerned because he knew exactly what he had gone through and wanted to kind of be there for the guy who got hit. So he kind of left the Cleveland clubhouse or dugout and came into the St. Louis clubhouse. And they said they're going to throw him in the shower. And they said, don't go in. If you go in the shower, that could finish you off. You could, the shock or whatever it was, the cold water could, whatever.
Wow.
You could be dead. You could be dead. And so Ken backed off. And later in life, Ken had read about a minor league baseball player who, in fact, got hit in the head, went into the shower and died afterwards after taking the shower. So he was fortunate Chick Fuster, unfortunate to get hit, fortunate that Chick Fuster was there to perhaps, save his life, talk him out of that. And it was an unfortunate ending of the season. You mentioned he was having a great season. He probably would have won another home run crown that year if he had stayed healthy.
And the Browns, how good were the Browns that season? Were they a contender?
The funny part is when Ken was healthy, the pitching staff was atrocious, and it was horrible. They were giving up like 10 runs a game, tons of double-digit, lots of time. It was so bad. And then Ken got hurt, and the pitching staff suddenly turned around, and the guys who were stinking suddenly started throwing great baseball. So they kind of finished 500, but they were kind of a good hitting team when Ken was around, and a good pitching team when Ken was not around. So maybe if Ken was there, that would help them push up in the standings a little bit. I don't know, but they probably wouldn't have won. But the pitching was through the whole year. Maybe they would have been a contender. But the pitching was so bad early on. It was. I think it's just those scores. It's like, oh my gosh! And then somehow, whatever reason, these guys turned around. Maybe they knew they had no hitting, so they had to pitch because Ken was really the best hitter on the team. Sisler was kind of a shadow of himself at that point. So it's kind of an interesting season the way that turned out for them. He did lead the league in slugging percentage that year, though, and I said he would have missed a lot of games that year. He would have led the league in home runs if he'd stayed healthy. So it's really a pity what happened to him.
Yeah, and you could always say what if. But when you take a look back at that one particular year, the way he was hitting the ball, you almost have to wonder if that was the season that ultimately scarred him as far as never being elected to the Hall of Fame. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So, of course, he misses the rest of the season. And really, that was the last big season he had. He never hit as many as 20 home runs in a season again. So how much did the concussion play a role in that as far as, the kind of years he had following that? And maybe how much did his real age play a role in the fact that he didn't hit as many as 20 home runs again?
Sure. Well, first off, the concussion, that definitely, he was out for a while. I mean, he was hospitalized, and he had buzzing in his head months later still. So it definitely affected him. I think early on, you get hit like that, it's gonna, you need to get your confidence back, and it probably took him a couple months to do that. And in 1926, Dan Holley was now the manager of the Browns, and he would start platooning. Maybe we're still there. I take it back, but they would start platooning Ken, and they wouldn't really start him, at the bench, and he just couldn't get into a groove. The funny part is, once they started getting him back in the lineup, he hit. And the concussion was a thing of the past. Mm-hmm. I know the numbers in front of me, and they're in the book, so please, if you read the book, I appreciate it. Their numbers are in the book of how well he did once he got in the lineup. His overall numbers, he only had 280 that year, which is his worst batting average ever, because he kind of got off to that slow start. Mm-hmm. But he did 17 dingers in 108 games, which isn't bad, and he was 36 years old at the time. So I think the concussion early on affected him, but that was it. And then after that, it was nothing. It was no longer an issue. I think people have written that the concussion cost him his career, and he never was the same hitter. I think that's just not true. Mm-hmm. If you look at his numbers from 26 to 29, when he started, he had great starting. He was in the starting lineup. He hit. Period. Mm-hmm. Now the age thing is interesting. You brought that up, because I actually called up a statistic today. For this purpose. So he hit 17 home runs in 26 and 17 home runs in 27. He was 37 years old. He turned 37 years old in 1927. Mm-hmm. So I looked this up today on Baseball Reference. It was a great website. So his last year was 1929. So from the start of professional baseball until 1929, only 11 times in history did a player 35 years old or older hit 17 home runs in a season. He did it 3 times of those 11.
Wow.
And then Cy Williams did it 4 times, and he played for Philadelphia. And Philadelphia had a right field fence that was like 300 feet in right center field.
It was like the Baker Bowl or something.
Baker Bowl, right. Yeah. It was a bandbox. It was a bandbox. So he was playing so 4 times with Cy Williams, he played in the bandbox. So at least 7. And the other time, Sam Thompson also played in that bandbox. So take him out, right, if you want to do that. There's 6. He didn't. So Ken had half those. So it was not common for players of his age, 1, to be playing, period, really, and 2, to be productive at that age. It wasn't the way it was back then. These guys would get to be 34 years old and they'd be cast off to the minors and finish their careers out there. They just didn't stay in shape or whatever, but Ken stayed in shape, obviously, and he could hit into 1929 he hit 345. Mm-hmm. He was 39 years old, but he was a part-time player, and I think that's what happened. You get older, he moved to a different team, the park changed, and power saps a little bit, and he was kind of, like I said, kind of became a part-time player. So I think it was a combination of they weren't making him a full-time player. Again, look at his stats when he started. They were excellent. When he was pinch hitting, they were not. And I think age did catch up with him, but he slugged 540 his last year in the major league. So wow. He's still, limited time, but still slugged 540. So he can still poke him out there.
Well, after the 27 season, St. Louis sent Ken Williams to the Red Sox, and they were now owned by Bob Quinn, who played such a role in bringing Ken to the Browns in the first place. Right. And in Ken's first year with Boston, he hit a more than respectable 303. I mean, you just said before, his lowest batting average for a season was 280. Go figure. But, that's really bad, 280. I feel bad for the guy. But, he hits 303. He only hit 8 home runs, but he knocked in 67, certainly far off the numbers he was used to putting up. Then in 1928, that's really where it all came to an end. And the end started, ironically, on a play that involved Wally Gerber, his teammate in St. Louis, who was later traded to Boston. What happened?
Yeah, this happened more than one occasion when they played for St. Louis, but on a fly ball, one of those fly balls, a shallow left or center, whatever it was, and Ken's coming in, Wally plays shortstop, he's going back, and someone didn't call for it properly, I guess, and they'd bang into each other and get knocked slowly to the ground, and that happened to Ken a few times. And injuries, when you get older, they're harder to come back from too. He got hurt in 1928, and that kind of his production dipped off a little bit. And then 29, he ran into Wally, and that didn't help his cause. And at the end of the career, he knocked the ball off his foot, and that pretty much finished it off. But when you're 39, when you're 29 and 39, it's a big difference in baseball years and coming back from injuries. And he got hurt a lot early in his career. He was able to come back relatively well. Late in your career, it's not as easy to come back from.
Sure.
And so one too many running into Wally Gerbers helped finish him off.
Earlier in the podcast, you had said that Ken Williams was the kind of guy who could fall out of bed and hit. And even after all of this, he still played somewhat sparingly, and he still hit. But he didn't have the ability really to play every day anymore. And I found this really interesting, funny, enlightening. The National League at this point had come up with the idea to use a pinch hitter every time the pitcher was to bat, really a designated hitter. The American League wanted nothing to do with it. They a designated hitter for the pitcher. Are you crazy? Had the rule been adopted, Williams might have actually played a little bit longer. Funny how things worked out, though, isn't it? Ultimately, the National League says a designated hitter, no way, and the American League adopts the rule. How funny is that?
Yeah, it was pretty funny when I read that. I had no idea that actually happened, so I was really funny when I read it. And I feel bad for Ken because he definitely could have stuck around a couple more years because he played in the minors a couple more years. I mean, Boston had him playing in center field at 39 years old, which is crazy.
Right. But again, they only thought he was 34, 35. But
True.
regardless, I mean, he had played really right field or left field for most of his career, and they're putting him out in center field. And he wasn't exactly the worst thing out there, not on that team. True.
It was not a very good team. I felt bad for him. He got sent to Boston, to be perfectly honest. The Yankees wanted him at some point, and that. Imagine if he was in the, that Murderers Row gang and what he would have done that team and that short portion right field in New York too. There always seems after him and going to Boston, career-wise, it's probably the worst thing that could happen to him. I mean, he was fine with it. He knew Bob Quinn. He was happy to play in Boston, but that was not a good team. That was if he could got it, St. Louis was a bad team. Boston was worse. That franchise was even worse shape. It's hard to believe. That was not a good team.
But he did finally make it to the Yankees, but he never made it out of spring training, again, because of injuries. It sure would have been interesting, though, don't you think, had he played for the Yankees during the height of his career? Who knows? Ken Williams might actually have made it to the Hall of Fame if he had played for the Yankees, don't you think?
Yeah, there were rumors in the mid-20s, so he could have been part of the 26, 27 Yankees, who were obviously some pretty good teams there. I don't know where it would have fit in, but he would have hit a lot of home runs at Yankee Stadium or the Polo Grounds, or actually Yankee Stadium by that point, because that stadium was built for him just as much as St. Louis was. The left-handed power guys do well, so and playing for a winner would have helped his cause as well.
Sure.
Playing with the Yankees, obviously, anyone who plays for the Yankees seems to get a boost regardless.
So, I mean, this guy, he really loved baseball. And even after his days in the majors were over, he couldn't shake that love for the game. And he went back to playing the PCL, and he put up some pretty good numbers for the Portland Beavers in 1930. But I think finally age caught up with him midway through his 31 season, the 1931 season, that is, and he finally called it quits. What was life without baseball like for Ken after his playing days were over?
Yeah, so you mentioned Ken played for Portland. He wanted to play again. He had a few offers in the minors, but wanted to stay close to home to be with his wife and children, or right near where he's from. So once that was done, he was near home. He was a home guy. He was a hometown guy. At Grants Pass is where he wanted to live, and that's where he went back to. And he just became a part of the community. He would help out the high school, helping with baseball. If they needed help with that, he'd referee boxing matches in town. He eventually became a police officer, which wasn't like again, small town. Think more Barney Fife than anything else, I guess. But it wasn't it wasn't anything too crazy going on in Grants Pass. But it was a way to make a living, especially in the Depression. He had a problem getting a job. They were like everyone else. He was lacking money. He had to dip into his baseball money during that time. He created something called Ken's Crunchers, which were a potato chip snack kind of thing to make money off of that before getting into the police. And he eventually owned a bar, a billiard hall, with the guy I mentioned way early, Bud Pernall, who came back to Grants Pass, and they owned the bar together. And that's pretty much what he did for the rest of his life until the end. He had some health problems and had to stop doing it. But he'd sit in there and tell stories, if anyone ever asked. Never really reflected on his past. Even his son said that. He never really talked baseball or about his playing days. If someone asked him, he'd be happy to talk about it. But he wasn't the kind of guy. He wasn't the kind of guy who would reflect on the past.
Interesting. When we opened today's edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes, I mentioned how you started your book by talking about the fact that there was a banquet being held in St. Louis to honor past stars of St. Louis baseball. And Ken Williams was afraid that no one would know who he was, that he was forgotten. Later on, you wrote that during his phenomenal 1922 season, a photographer was tasked with grabbing a photo of him, and he took a picture of Bill Jacobson instead. And he submitted that photo saying that was Ken Williams. I mean, talk about playing in obscurity. Ken wasn't that far off, was he?
No, he wasn't. I think they finally learned who he was, but that was ironic. I think some paper in St. Louis mentioned this is Babe Ruth never would know who he is. It showed the lack of respect that St. Louis and Ken was getting at the time. He would get the respect eventually, but it was kind of a funny moment that they took a picture of Baby Doll Jacobson instead of Ken not knowing. And Baby Doll Jacobson was a right-handed hitter, and Ken was a lefty. It made it even funny.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Hey, when you were writing the book, Ken Williams, A Slugger in Ruth's Shadow, what surprised you most? What did you find out that really made you shake your head?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I mentioned earlier the thing about 1911 when he played up in Sacramento. I'd never heard that before, and that was a great find. I really loved it. Just reading about it in the minors, and the kind of guy he was interesting. I read a lot of things about how he was, aloof and no one liked him, and I found that not to be true. I found he did have friends in the game, and he was made captain of one of their barnstorming teams. And, manage that. Why would they have someone who they didn't like manage their barnstorming team? I read how George Sisler didn't like him, and that I found that not to be true. Maybe at some point it was. They may have had a little rift, but Sisler vowed he would not trade Ken Williams. Like, he was the one guy he would not trade. So it was. I found a lot of these things that you read as, I don't want to say gospel, but you read that through the years, and obviously people out there probably haven't read about Ken Williams like I have and found information out. But the thing to see, when you do the actual research, you find out they're not always true. Just stories are carried on because one person said it gets carried on as fact. And it's one of the things with this not fact. I don't think he was a gregarious personality that everyone loved, but he was a guy who had friends in baseball and kept in touch with guys and had a good time and got along with Sisler for the most part and was a crab. And it could be all these. That's okay. But he was also a great hitter, and I found out really what a great hitter he was and how respected he was. Really looking into the numbers of how going back and not only just looking at the stats and going online and seeing where he ranks in history, but there were guys in the 20s who did statistical analysis back then and found out he was one of the best hitters in the game. Mentioned these great names that we talk about all the time. And I remember Amos Rusi, quote, Amos Rusi in the Hall of Fame, pitched in the 1800s. Say, oh, no surprise, Williams is one of the hardest hitters. And it's, it shows you the respect he had as a hitter back then when a guy like Amos Rusi was in the Hall of Fame, back in 1920, he was saying, yeah, of course, he's one of the hardest hitters. We would expect him to be. It just shows what kind of hitter he really was.
One of the reasons I do this podcast is to talk about guys whom time has forgotten for whatever reason. And on the previous episode, we talked about a guy by the name of Hal Trotsky, who was a phenomenal first baseman for the Cleveland Indians. And it just blows my mind that very few Indian fans can even remember Hal Trosky. But then when I look at the career of Ken Williams, you know, I get it. The Browns are no longer around. But when you look at the entire body of work, you got to scratch your head and say, how do people not know or remember Ken Williams? And is it an injustice in your mind that this guy is not in Cooperstown?
Ooh, injustice that's a strong word. It's a tough word. You know, I do go in the pros and cons in the book of whether he should be in or not. And really, if you look at the stats and take, you know, if you take away what I will call the steroid era, you know, when that kind of kicks in, and look where he ranks in history, you'd be surprised how high he is. People out there listening, hopefully, his slugging percentage, his batting average, his on-base percentage, he's ranked very high, and the guys ahead in front of him are 900% in the Hall of Fame. So, on that basis, yeah, maybe he should be in the Hall of Fame. But at the same point, I get why he's not. His numbers aren't really eye-popping. You know, we're in the era of the home run, so 196 home runs isn't exactly going to stand out. You got middle infielders who are hitting 220 doing that over 5 years. You know,
but a 319 career batting average, his slugging percentage, his OPS, all these years where he hit more home runs than he struck out. He didn't strike out a lot. And again, I'm not the person to induct a guy into the Hall of Fame. I'm just asking the question, what is the sentiment out there? You know, do the voters today even know enough about Ken Williams?
Right. Well, I would say that question, no, they should read the book. But you know, in 1970-ish, around there were some articles in the Sporting News where people they were stumping for Ken, saying, hey, why is this guy not in the Hall of Fame? So even as recently as, 40 whatever years ago, there were people who were kind of like, what's going on? Why he is kind of forgotten? Why is he not in the Hall of Fame? And I think he is forgotten because you mentioned the Browns don't exist anymore, right? So that's there's no history. People aren't talking about the Browns. He did not play for a winning team, obviously. And once his career ended, offense started picking up. He did an era where the offense was slowly starting to pick up and had great numbers, but then the numbers started blowing up in the 30s and the 40s, you know, to today, where his numbers are paling in comparison because, you know, that's the way it is. He didn't play long enough or whatever you want to say. But I think, you know, I try to lay the case on the book both ways, why he should be in, maybe why he isn't. And I can see it both ways. I would love him to be in. I think he is, you know, one of the best players, obviously, in the franchise history of the Browns, even considering the Orioles. He's up there as well. The numbers speak for themselves. Do I think he'll ever be in? It's probably doubtful at this point. You know, we're in 2019, unless someone's going to read my book and say, yes, he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. He should get on the veterans ballot. He's been a couple times. He's been in a couple times and hasn't got much traction. I don't know why. Love to see it. I think he was an absolutely great hitter, but hopefully he will not be forgotten now. That's the way I kind of put in the book. You know, when I did this book, I was able to talk to his sons, which was just fantastic. And just hearing I called his son and told him the book is published because he had heard us before. People talk about his dad and he's been in the Hall of Fame and it doesn't happen, blah, blah, blah. And when I finally told him, hey, the book is published, I'm sending one to you, he was so ecstatic and happy for it that, you know, maybe Ken won't get in the Hall of Fame, but I'm happy that at least his family knows people haven't forgot about him. And his career shouldn't be forgotten because he was a great player.
That's awesome. Hey, where can people get a hold of your book, Ken Williams, A Slugger and Ruth's Shadow?
Yeah, it's available. It's posted by McFarland Books. You can go on their website, obviously, Amazon, whatever else you shop, Barnes & Noble, whatever, online. Those places who shop online, they're there. If you can't find it, I'm on Twitter. You can Twitter, send me a tweet, Dave_Heller, and I'll help you find one for sure. Definitely appreciate anyone who wants to buy one.
Awesome. Now, you've written a couple other books as well, one about the 1944 St. Louis Browns and another very interesting about what it was like to face Ted Williams. Are you working on anything new now?
I'm always kind of messing around, seeing what I can find out. I try not to say too much because I feel like I'm going to jinx myself if I give anything away. You never know what's going to be in the future. But hey, if anyone's got any good ideas, throw them my way. I'm always interested. I love old-time baseball. People, we couldn't watch these guys, and we know so little. So any research you can find on these guys, that's why I think it's fascinating to find out about these guys that we know so little about.
Sure. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. And hey, I hope you would consider coming back again.
Oh, of course. Hey, it was a great time. I really appreciate having me. And I said, I always talk about Ken anytime. So thank you so much for having me on.
Awesome. Thank you. I thought it was pretty cool that baseball fans in St. Louis gave Ken such a warm reception when he returned for that banquet. After all, he was one of the greatest to ever play in St. Louis, and had the team had any pitching, perhaps they could have made more noise in St. Louis, and maybe, just maybe, there could still be 2 baseball teams in St. Louis. With the Browns, Williams hit .326 with 185 home runs and 811 RBI. He also stole 144 bases. Overall for his career, he hit .319 with 196 home runs, 916 RBI, and 154 stolen bases. His career OPS, .924. But not having made it as a full-time player until he was 30 years old certainly affected his ability to rack up even more numbers. Still, Ken Williams had quite the impressive career. Thanks again to today's guest, Dave Heller, author of Ken Williams, A Slugger in Ruth's Shadow. And thanks to you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.